Dia a todas, a todos. Também quero cumprimentar especialmente aqueles que nos acompanham pela virtualidade. Temos cerca de 210 pessoas acompanhando neste momento o evento e aqueles que puderam estar aqui prestigiando presencialmente. Hoje, a Escola da Magistratura, por intermédio do seu Fórum de Direito Penal, que eu presido, e Marco Chute é o vice-presidente, se engalana, porque eu diria, feliz coincidência, nós estamos em um evento, vamos realizar um evento que envolve a democracia, um professor especialista na matéria que vai nos brindar, e no momento em que ontem foi marcante para todos nós, estávamos conversando aqui antes, no início do evento, e muitos nem dormiram, aguardando as notícias, enfim. É um momento de emoção, é um momento marcante, é um momento que, para o povo judeu, o povo de Israel e o mundo inteiro, aguardava essa notícia. Que eu espero que ela se firme, claro, as consequências, mas era necessário. Esse sofrimento precisava ser concluído, terminado, para que as pessoas pudessem voltar a viver. Em Gaza, em Israel, enfim, em todo o entorno que há nessas preocupações. E há outros momentos e há outros cenários que também precisam ser enfrentados, como o caso da Ucrânia e tantos outros. E, nessa feliz coincidência, o nosso fórum, a Escola da Magistratura, dirigida pelo desembargador Cláudio Delor, abriu espaço para que um convidado de Israel, um professor da Universidade de Haifa, que já dirigiu, um professor que já assessorou vários presidentes da Suprema Corte de Israel, nos falar sobre o Judiciário e, através do ataque ao Poder Judiciário, meu caro Tortman, que agradeço a presença, temos também uma afronta à democracia, diretamente. E podemos até dizer, sem entrar em questões políticas, isso ocorre no Brasil, vem ocorrendo no Brasil. A nossa democracia vem sendo, professor, atingida. Ocorre na Venezuela, e eu diria, ocorre nos Estados Unidos, pelo que estamos acompanhando, em que decisões judiciais sofrem um ataque imediato ao chefe do executivo, que merece parabéns por tudo que está fazendo agora, em termos de uma solução para o problema existente em Gaza. Ninguém negará isso. Quero crer o seu esforço, as consequências do seu ato. Mas, em terras americanas, tem questionado decisões da magistratura, tanto federais como estaduais. Enfim, então, esse tema está na ordem do dia. Para nós, brasileiros, sabermos como está essa questão, quer dizer, esse cerco ao judiciário, o caso israelense, que foi o tema proposto, mas principalmente as bases do que é uma verdadeira democracia. E, para isso, numa intermediação, num convênio, num contato maravilhoso com o Instituto Brasil-Israel, nós conseguimos a presença aqui do professor Eli. E, para participar deste evento, nós temos a professora ADRIANA, SULAM, SAUL, ZEBULUN, e os dois moderadores, Marcos André Schutt, né, meu amigo, vice-presidente do nosso fórum, desembargador desta casa, e a professora Stephanie Assaf, né, que vão fazer um debate após os esclarecimentos, a fala do professor Eli. Professor Eli, eu quero agradecer e quero pedir, então, licença primeiro para reconhecer e homenagear não só os membros do Ministério Público, da magistratura, os membros da advocacia e os nossos convidados, servidores do Judiciário que aqui estão. Peço licença para não ter que nominá-los todos, porque demandaria, mas fico muito feliz. E melhor do que eu só estou fazendo a apresentação como presidente do Fórum e agradecer esse intercâmbio com o Instituto Brasil-Israel, eu quero pedir à professora ADRIANA ZEBULUN, conselheira do Instituto Brasil-Israel e coordenadora do Instituto aqui no Rio de Janeiro, para fazer as nossas homenagens por este evento, notadamente ao professor Eli. Professora ADRIANA.
Obrigada. Bom dia a todos. Já peço desculpa de antemão, que eu vou ser bem repetitiva, porque o tema pede que a gente relembre, que a gente repita. É uma grande honra estar aqui hoje, representando o Instituto Brasil-Israel, e abrir esse encontro tão importante, promovido em parceria com a EMERJ. Agradeço ao desembargador Marcos Schutt e ao desembargador José MUIÑOS Pinheiro, e também a nossa mediadora Stephanie Assaf. Ontem foi um dia especial, eu tenho que repetir, um dia de muita emoção, depois de 2 anos de muita angústia e sofrimento para israelenses e palestinos, tivemos um cessar-fogo e um retorno dos reféns a Israel. Ainda não podemos falar de paz, mas nos enchemos de esperança. Vivemos em tempos em que a democracia em Israel, no Brasil e no mundo vem sendo constantemente colocada à prova. E é justamente nesses momentos que o diálogo entre direito, sociedade e cultura se torna essencial. O Instituto Brasil-Israel, desde sua criação, tem se dedicado a promover o conhecimento, o debate plural e o fortalecimento da convivência democrática. Nosso propósito é construir pontes entre pessoas, ideias e instituições. E mostrar que é possível discutir temas sensíveis com serenidade, profundidade e respeito às diferenças. Hoje, temos a honra de receber Eli Salzberg, um dos mais renomados juristas israelenses, cuja trajetória acadêmica e atuação pública representam, de forma admirável, a defesa intransigente do Estado de Direito e dos valores democráticos. Sua presença aqui é um convite à reflexão sobre como proteger as instituições quando elas se veem sob ataque, e sobre o papel fundamental da justiça e da cidadania nesse processo. Quero agradecer à EMERJ pela parceria e por abrir esse espaço para um diálogo tão necessário, e agradecer a presença de todos aqui e virtualmente. Que essa manhã nos inspire a olhar para o caso israelense não como algo distante, mas como um espelho dos desafios globais que enfrentamos. O desafio de preservar a democracia viva, vibrante e plural. Obrigada.
Bom, passo agora a palavra ao professor Eli Salzberg. Por favor, a palavra é sua.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really a great honor for me to be here, to be invited by this very prestigious School for Magistrates, on which I read a lot, the school that strengthens the rule of law, democracy, is open to the public, and is a real model for judicial training. As my previous speaker said, this is a very special day. Actually, today is the holiday of Simchat Torah, of the joy of the Bible, in Jewish tradition, we ended reading the whole Bible in the last year, and we restart from scratches to read the Bible. And this really a day that signifies maybe a change in Israel with regard to our very bitter war that is already 2 years old. Simchat Torah is also the day in which the Hamas attacked Israel, the 7th of October, took these hostages, 250 hostages, killed about 1,200 people. And it's really symbolic that on this day, the remaining hostages were freed, that there is a change of course towards peace, probably under the boot of President Trump, but not necessarily a change with regard to democratic course, and I will focus on in this talk on this subject. Actually, in the last 2.5 years, we liberal Israelis are fighting 3 different wars. One war is a war against our enemies, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis. A second war is a war against anti-Semitism, rising anti-Semitism around the world, which was promoted and prompted by the Gaza war. And the third war on which I want to focus today is a war against Israeli democracy. War launched by this current government, which I think is the most problematic and the most dangerous war to the future of Israel. And on this, I want to talk a little bit today. I prepared my slides in English. ChatGPT translated some of them into Portuguese, Brazilian. I don't know if it done so well. So you let me know afterwards how it goes. And before talking about Israel, I want to talk about democracy, liberal democracy, the state of the democracy, and the trends that we have been seeing in the last years. This is a map of liberal democracy 2024. And as you can see, the non-democratic world, which is the red, bold red, light red, is dominating. The democratic world is the blue, stronger democracy in hard blue, and flawed democracy, which Israel was categorized as part of, are in light blue. This is a static picture of today, 2024. But this reflects also a 25 years deterioration of liberal democracy. From a VDEM report, and VDEM is probably the best institute that measures democracy around the world. From the VDEM report, we can learn that the state of democracy today in 2025 goes back to the level of 1996 or 1985, depends how you measure. It also says that about more than 70% of the world population lives under autocracies. It also says that 40% of the world countries are in a process of democratic backsliding. And when you look at democracy in a bigger picture, the history of democracy, it is a very short history, as you know. Democracy was conceived in the 18th century and practiced only in one country then, the US. In the 19th centuries, monarchists fought against it and won. In the eve of the Second World War, there were only 11 democracies in the world. Okay? The big push and rise of liberal democracy was after the Second World War, and of course was the result of the horrors of the Second World War. And democracy, liberal democracy, reached its peak in the end of the 20th century with the fall of the wall, of the Berlin Wall, with the democratization of Central and Eastern European countries, when it reached about 40% of the world population. But as I said, democracy is in decline already for about 25, 30 years. And this decline is not only in the peripheries of the democratic world, it's only in the heart, it's also in the heart of the liberal democracy thinking, Europe and the United States. So what is happening in Israel, which I will talk a little bit about in a second, fits a general trend, this trend can be called democratic backsliding, and I will talk about it a little bit later. Altogether, in the history, the short history of liberal democracy, you know, people always looked for a way how to govern themselves. Self-governing is a phenomena of human existence, and in the grand history of mankind, liberal democracy, 75 years, is a very, very small dot. From this perspective, we might see the end of liberal democracy, but we can talk about it later in the discussion and question time. So altogether, when we sum up to now the record of liberal democracy, only 22 countries in the last 75 years managed an uninterrupted liberal democracy. Uninterrupted meaning that there were no coup d'etat, dictatorship in those 75 years. And miraculously, Israel, the state of Israel, is one of these 22 countries. It's the only country that was established after the Second World War that belongs to this very luxurious club. Today, there are only 21 full democracies and about 53 flawed democracies. And unfortunately, in the last report of the VDEM index, Israel, for the first time in its history, is not regarded as a democracy, but as a hybrid regime. Okay? This is the ranking of Israel in the last years, from being ranked in 2006 in the 32nd place in the world. It deteriorated to the 53rd place in 2023. And as I said, last year, it crossed the threshold of liberal democracy. What is happening in Israel? I talked a little bit about the global developments and the global picture. Within this global picture and global development, we have a phenomena in which many countries that are autocratizing share, and this is democratic backsliding. And in a sense, I don't know enough about Brazil, but in a sense, I think that to some degree, Brazil also belongs to this club of democratic backsliding. What is democratic backsliding? Democratic backsliding is moving from a democracy to autocracy, not in the same shape of old-fashioned dictatorship, not in the old shape of Stalinism or Nazism, or very ruthless dictatorships in which the opponents of the government are being executed and removed. Backsliding democracy is a phenomenon in which countries move to autocracies but claim that they are democracies. This is a misunderstanding of the concept of democracy, as having only the rule of the majority ruling. Okay? So this phenomena of democratic backsliding is characterized by facts that populist leaders actually work to dismantle every check and balance mechanism in the system. Among them, of course, independent judiciary, and we'll talk about this in a second, but also other mechanisms like free media, free stages for expressing your opinion, freedom of speech, and other checks and balances mechanism that exist very differently in very different legal systems. Okay? After dismantling separation of powers, after getting control over the media, which actually broadcasts and transfers to the public not the truth, but the government messages, they can stage elections and expect to be re-elected because the people don't know enough. The people are not, do not have the right information to whom to vote, and all the mechanisms of separation of powers are dismantled. This is the autocratizing through the usage of the language of democracy. And in a sense, Israel is experiencing, unfortunately, exactly this kind of the phenomenon of the democratic backslide. So let me talk a little bit about Israel, and it's important to understand the background of the structure of government in Israel, which is a very different structure of government than in Brazil, for example. And this will explain why the vulnerability of Israeli democracy is even much greater than that of many other democratic countries which have a structure of government with a lot of mechanisms, separation of powers. Israel's structure of government, which actually was dictated by the United Nations. That's interesting. The United Nations Partition Resolution, which recognized the state of Israel, the future state of Israel, by the way, along a state of Palestine, actually prescribed its system of government. It is based on a unicameral parliament, one house of parliament, 120 members, elected on the basis of national proportion representation, whereas the government enjoys confidence or is basically is not detached from the legislators. The government, the executive, is elected by the parliament. We don't have in Israel federal structure like you have, and a federal structure is a mechanism of separation of powers which prevents the tyranny of the majority. We don't have in Israel district-based elections. It's all national elections. We don't have in Israel separation between the executive and the legislator, as, for example, you have here in the American system, in which you vote to the president in a different election than voting to your members of parliament. We don't have in Israel any separation of powers mechanism which bound the government to a supranational organization, except of course the United Nations, but we don't have a club of countries like the European Union or other clubs that are also mechanism of separation of power. So basically, Israel lacks most of the mechanisms of separation of powers that exist in most other democracies. How did Israel managed to maintain uninterrupted democracy in the last 75 years, it is because the one institution that was developed to check and balance the power of the government, the power of the executive, is an independent judiciary. This is the reason why trying to destruct or trying to dismantle the judiciary in Israel, or the independence of the judiciary, is so extreme and so significant to the fall, possible fall of the democratic order. As you can see in this table, when you compare Israel to other states, democratic states, which have various mechanisms of checks and balances, like federalism, two houses of parliaments. By the way, the fact that there are two houses of parliament is an anti-tyranny of the majority mechanism, because if you have to pass laws in two houses that represent differently the population, it means that laws do not represent raw majority. Okay? So we have one house of parliament. We don't have federalism. We don't have other mechanisms of checks and balances. The only thing we have is an independent judiciary. What happened in Israel in the last 3 years? Okay. Preceded to the constitutional revolution, or what I will term a coup d'etat by the government against the democratic order in Israel, was a period of instability, political instability, that began with the actually indictment of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 2019, a trial that is still pending for corruption charges, which brought to the fall of the government, inability to establish a different government, 3 sets of elections. In one of them, March 2021, anti-Netanyahu camp rose to power and had a government for 1 year, which also fell because of lack of majority in parliament, which brought us to the last election in Israel in November 2022, in which the Likud and its allies won first Israeli government in which Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu, is not surrounded in a coalition partnership with people from the left and from the right or from the center, but he is actually the most leftist position in the government. This is the most right-wing, the most fundamental, the most religious government that we ever had. As you can see from this picture, it's also a government with the least number of women as ministers. So this is really a regression from the point of view of the identity of the Israeli government. It is also the most corrupted Israeli government we ever had, with 5 ministers, including Netanyahu himself, either convicted for criminal offenses or actually on trial. A few weeks after the government formation, the Minister of Justice had a press conference announcing a plan for a judicial reform. This judicial reform, as I said, should be viewed in the background of the fact that the judiciary in Israel, the independence of the judiciary, is the only mechanism of checks and balances on the raw majority. This judicial reform meant basically to dismantle judicial independence in a kind of a pincer movement. On one side, the Minister of Justice said, we will change the way judges are elected, and I will talk about a little bit later, because the way that judges are elected in Israel is very unique. Okay? Changing the judicial election system so that the government basically can elect the people that it wants to be judges. And on the other hand, preventing from the courts to perform essential duties necessary in democratic countries, judicial review of legislation. In Israel, there is no written constitution. I can talk about this as well. It's a very interesting phenomenon. There are only 4 countries in the world without a written constitution. Israel is one of them. We don't have a constitution. We have basic laws that are supposed in the future to be amalgamated into one constitution. And already in 1995, the court decided that it has the power to review laws, the legality of laws against the basic law. There was a question whether the court can review basic laws themselves. So part of the initiative of the Minister of Justice was to prevent altogether the court to perform judicial review of basic laws, to require a majority of 13 or 15 judges in the Supreme Court, which means basically that you cannot review laws against basic laws, to allow the Knesset, even if the court provides judicial review and struck down legislation as contradicting a basic law, to allow the Knesset to override the court decision by a majority of voters of the Knesset, which is basically a system that is imported from the Canadian legal constitutional structure. In Canada, the parliament can override, in certain circumstances, decisions of the Supreme Court. By the way, this is another element or another characteristic of democratic backsliding, when those who want to destroy democracy take implants or take examples or pieces of various arrangements from other legal systems and say, oh, Canada is a democratic country, very democratic country, why not adopt the system of override? Okay. This also reflects this autocratization by soft means. And the last measure was also to prevent the court not only to perform judicial review of legislation, but also judicial review of the administration itself. We have an English tradition. Our legal system has a lot of impact from the common law and the British legal system, as the Brits ruled Palestine for about 40 years before the State of Israel was established. And one of the principles in English administrative law is that the court can strike down administrative decisions that are highly unreasonable. This is the cause for judicial review, and the initiative announced by the Minister of Justice in January 2023 was also to abolish the reasonableness cause for judicial review of the administration. So as you can see from this initiative, the Minister of Justice, backed up, of course, by the Prime Minister, this reform could not be on its way without the blessing of Prime Minister Netanyahu, was to, on one hand, to prevent the court from performing any criticism or any review of the government or the legislator, and on the other hand, actually to destroy the independence of the court. In this format, our Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, actually adopted the Hungarian model. Why it is called the Hungarian model? Because when Viktor Orban came to power in, again, actually, in the middle of the 1990s, he said, we should act very quickly. we should do this revolution, coup d'etat against the courts, instantly, so the people will not have enough time to digest and understand these changes. Okay? This is the tactic of the Hungarian Blitz, and he succeeded. Okay? Now there's interesting writings that the Orban magic might fade away in the next election, but I'm not an expert on Hungary, so I will not get into it. But this was the tactic of the Israeli government, to do a very quick reform by legislating several laws before the public can actually understand what is happening. And after you do it, fait accompli, the public can protest as much as it wants, but we managed to conduct the revolution. Unfortunately, for Mr. Levin, the Israeli public, the Israeli civil society did not buy or was not quiet. And immediately after the announcement of the judicial reforms, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, and protests that actually from January 1923 until this very day, protests that are actually continuing every Saturday night, that shifted with the time after the horrible October 7th, to protest to release the soldiers, the hostages, and to end the war. So this protest movement, which I'm proud to be a member of, actually prevented the quick implementation of Yariv Levin's, our Minister of Justice, program. From all the steps that was proposed by the government, so far the only change that the Knesset managed to enact is to abolish, this is marked here in yellow, to abolish the cause of lack of reasonableness as a cause for administrative review. And the Supreme Court, in a judgment given in January 2024, actually struck down this change of the law. Let me talk a little bit about the system of electing judges, which might be the key element in the coup attempt by the Israeli government against the judiciary. We have a very unique system. We have one set of judiciary. We are not a federal country. We have one system of a judiciary, very compact, a Supreme Court, district courts, and magistrate courts. All of the judges are elected in the same way by a committee comprising 3 Supreme Court justices, 2 members of government, 2 members of the Knesset, usually 1 from the coalition, 1 from the opposition, and 2 representatives of the Israeli bar. Okay? So this is a 9 members committee in which you have representation for all 3 branches of government and the legal profession. It has political input, the 4 politicians, but a majority of experts, professional, the 3 judges and the 2 representative of the bar. And this system operates from 1953, many, many years. And it became actually a model to many common law countries which had before the English system of electing judges by the politicians, which actually also managed to had a political influence on the judiciary. So Britain and Canada and Australia and Ireland and many other countries actually took the Israeli system and implemented parts of it within the years. So this system, okay, meant that judicial independence is guaranteed because judges are mainly elected or based on professional skills. There is some political input, but it's not a political appointment. It's not like, for example, in the US, that the president nominates and the Senate, the president appoints and the Senate approves. And if the president and the Senate are in the same party, you can actually change the composition of the judiciary. And this, okay, was the key element of the judicial revolution. And as I said, until today, because of the very, very strong protest of the civil society in Israel, the Knesset, the government did not manage to pass a correction or a change to the law of how judges are elected. Another component, which I will not elaborate today, but I will be happy to address in the Q&A session, is trying to destroy another very important legal institution in Israel, which is part of our core separation of power, and this is the Attorney General institution. Alongside a very independent court, and actually, you know, the fact that Israel maintained a democratic structure since its existence is due to the independence of the court. Already in 1948, in the 3rd day of Israel existence, the court issued orders against the government. Alongside the independence of the courts in Israel, the Attorney General Office, the independence of the Attorney General Office is another important, significant, or maybe a key element of check and balance mechanism. The Attorney General is a very powerful position. Attorney General is elected by a committee. It's a political appointment, but it has total independence, and it serves, first of all, as the supreme authority deciding whether to indict, whether to press criminal charges. It is the legal advisor to the government, and the government has to accept its advices. And it also oversees the whole system of legal advisor to the different ministries, making sure that ministers will act within the rule of law. So a second fork of the coup d'etat was to dismantle the Attorney General independence, both its personal independence, saying Attorney General will be voted by the government without any screening of any qualifications or political affiliation, and that the powers of the Attorney General will be cut. He will not serve both as the supreme prosecutor and the legal advisor to the government. It will be divided into 2 sections, and Attorney General will also not be anymore responsible for all the legal advisors of the different ministries. So these reforms, again, were proposed by the Minister of Justice and did not materialize yet. I just want to quote before we proceed to conclude this talk. What our Chief Justice, the President of our Supreme Court at the time of this proposed reform by the Minister of Justice had stated, okay, Chief Justice Esther Hayut, now already in pension, said this is a plan to crash the justice system. It is designed to give a fatal blow to the independence of the judiciary. This is a plan to destroy the country's democratic identity. This is a fatal blow to it. This is very, very, very rare expression, or very rare kind of statement by our Chief Justice, or by judges altogether. In Israel, judges don't have any, you don't find any political expression by judges. They are prevented from saying their views on legislation, and this shows you the extremity of the plan. Now, this coup d'etat in Israel, attempt coup d'etat to overcome the judiciary, was not just for the sake of having more powers to the government. The government had a drawer plan to advance various reforms, substantive reforms, which it knew that the court will strike down as unconstitutional, as violating our basic laws. And there are about 250 bills, anti-democratic bills, on the Knesset agenda. Very few of them were actually progressed and transformed into law since. But it shows you that it's not only a matter of power game, that the government wants to have more power. These power gains are meant to change the Israeli society and the character of the state of Israel from scratches. It includes politicizing the police, politicizing the army. It includes jurisdiction to religious courts at the expense of civil courts. It includes changing the education system. It includes abolishing the independence of academia, higher universities and higher education. So the change in the legal structure, the constitutional structure of the judiciary was meant to pave the way to a far more reaching revolution that will advance Israel not only to an autocratic rule, but to a full-scale dictatorship. And as I said, about 250 bills presented in the Knesset, only very few were enacted. But for example, politicization of the police went through with a very, very extreme minister of police, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now the police is much more politicized. This is, by the way, not the worst of future-looking changes, because the police is a very hierarchical organization. If, you know, in future government, the police will be in other hands, the chain of command will resort back, will bring back a neutral, an objective, or a national neutral police. But changes in the education system, for example, changes in the independence of higher education. Israel's success relies on it's innovative, high-tech industry, which is the result of freedom of the academia. And of course, this, if you change, is much more difficult to amend within few years. Okay, anyway, this was the proposed plan of the government. As I said, very quickly, civil society in Israel organized, demonstrating every Saturday evening. 2 million Israelis. Israel is a small country. We have only 10 million people in Israel. 2 million people took to the street, fifth of Israel population. And also various organizations, very key and important organizations like Air Force pilot. This is part of the allegations of the government against the civil society, for allegation that they contributed to the 7th of October massacre, promoting Hamas to see that Israel is a divided society and so forth. So it's all, of course, nonsense. But Air Force pilots, various high-tech people, economists, academia, and also law professors. And if you want to learn more on the attempt coup d'etat by the government, about the Israeli system, about its liberal democratic structure, you can look at our website, the Law Professor for Democracy. We are about 150 law professors. Again, a small country, 150 law professors is majority of law professors in Israel. And you can see in this website a lot of our position papers and our activities. Just a few words to say what happened after the 7th of October. Of course, 7th of October 2023, 2 years ago, the vicious attack of the Hamas changed the whole attention of the public. And one would have expected that being in war with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Iran, will bring the government to say, okay, we pause, we postpone the debates about judicial reform or judicial or revolution to after the war and so forth and so on. This did not happen. The government actually shifted, continued with full force its coup attempt and shifted from the Hungarian blitz to the Polish salami system. Okay? Poland is another country with experienced very serious democratic backsliding, but not in the blitz of Orban, but step by step. And this was the tactic of the government since the 7th of October. For example, we don't change the law regarding how judges are elected, but we will just not elect any more judges. No judges were elected to the Supreme Court since October 23. So the Supreme Court now is smaller, have much heavier load, and the government actually, in a sense, without changing the legislation, is trying to kill the court at independence. The threatening of the government on judges and on the court brought also the Supreme Court to be much less interventionist. It is afraid to intervene. It's afraid to strike down legislation and governmental decisions. So this is not a big change in the constitutional structure. It's just a change on the ground. Right? Just a short example. Yesterday, as you know, after the hostages release, President Trump appeared in the Israeli Knesset in a very, very festive meeting. Usually to such meetings, all the head of the institutions, the main institutions, are invited. The Attorney General and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court were not invited. This is not a change of law, but it is a small step of how, by a salami system, you actually affect the independence of the judiciary. You want me to finish? Yes. So I'll just say that on top of the salami system changes in the independence of the court, we see in Israel also a deterioration of the basic facet of the rule of law, okay, which is also connected to the war. Since 7th of October, the police in Israel is conducting itself illegally. They, for example, arrest people on various expressions or speeches that are protected by the Constitution. Those people are, afterwards brought to the court and the court releases them. But this is an illegal action by the police. Governmental ministries say that they disregard or they will not listen to the obliging documents of the Attorney General. So this is again deterioration of some facets of the rule of law. As you know, beyond judicial independence and beyond separation of power, the mere fact that the principle of the rule of law, that the law is enforced and equally enforced on everyone, is the core element of a healthy and democratic society. Yesterday was an historical day. Donald Trump, imposed peace on Israel. He will not impose democracy on Israel. But the fact that now the public can divert its attention back to these core questions, the civil society that protest will go back to these issues of democratic structure and democratic culture, gives hope that we will manage with a very strong civil society to prevent this government from completing this coup d'etat. Thank you very much. By the way, this is a photograph of the biggest demonstration against the judicial overhaul. You can see the Supreme Court building in the middle, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, on the right, government headquarters on the other side of the protesters. And this is a protest of about 500,000 people who came to Jerusalem before the war. Thank you very much.
Professor Eli Salzberg, muito obrigado. Inicialmente, eu quero fazer um registro especial, pedir licença a todos. Professor, no Brasil, nosso sistema é federal, federalismo que vivemos, e também isso se traduz no nosso poder judiciário. Então, temos juízes estaduais, juízes federais e supremas cortes estaduais e federais. Eu queria aqui registrar que na nossa segunda instância do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, temos vários representantes que eu posso permitir da comunidade judaica. Um deles, Marcos André Schultz, desembargador, que veio do Ministério Público do Rio de Janeiro, e Denise Levi Tetler, que foi certamente a desembargadora Denise, representante do Judiciário em comissões de direitos humanos e faz um trabalho social muito grande, assim como Mauro Dickstein, que eu posso afirmar, já que estamos falando sobre defesa do Judiciário, seus postulados da própria instituição, sou testemunha no maior órgão judicial, o Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. Mauro Dickstein é uma das maiores lideranças de defesa dos postulados. Então, eu queria ter esse registro aqui da comunidade presente. evidente que vamos passar para o debate, mas duas coisas fizeram para mim importante na sua fala, professor. Uma delas, bom, primeiro, agradecer porque passamos a conhecer o sistema judicial e a estrutura em Israel. Ouvimos muito falar, mas hoje tivemos um especialista que vivencia na própria Suprema Corte a parte acadêmica e nos deu essa visão. E percebi que o ataque indireto à democracia, atacando-se ao judiciário, também foi um ataque ao Ministério Público local, à Procuradoria-Geral, quer dizer, até porque eu acredito que se não houver uma independência do judiciário e também não houver uma independência do Ministério Público local, aí sim temos uma democracia, realmente um subterfúgio de uma democracia. Mas o registro maior que eu gostaria de fazer aqui, que eu acompanhava, isso foi meu ânimo também, convidá-lo e participar do convite que o Instituto Brasil-Israel nos ofereceu. É muito comum nós verificarmos movimentos sociais, que é importantíssimo a participação da sociedade, fazendo críticas, em regra, ao Poder Executivo ou ao Poder Legislativo. Mas eu confesso, e já próximo dos 70 anos, e eu acho que eu nunca vi um movimento social para a defesa do Poder Judiciário como eu vi em Israel. E hoje eu o conheci com maiores detalhes, detalhadamente como aconteceu. É incrível. A defesa social, a defesa civil do Poder Judiciário. Muito obrigado, professor. Bom, para os nossos debates, cerca de 10, 15 minutos, passo então num acordo ao professor, meu colega e amigo desembargador, Marcos André Schutte.
Bom dia a todos. Eu vou começar pelos cumprimentos e pelos agradecimentos. Então, eu vou cumprimentar o meu irmão Dr. José MUIÑOS Pinheiro, em nome de quem agradeço à Escola da Magistratura do Estado do Rio de Janeiro por nos permitir trazer para o nosso convívio o professor Eli Salzberg, uma das maiores autoridades em sistema judiciário e democracia, e facilitar esse debate franco com a nossa sociedade, traçando um paralelo entre aquilo que Israel viveu e vive até hoje, em razão das guerras do Hamas, do Hezbollah e de outros vizinhos que não aceitam a existência do Estado de Israel, tornando muito difícil o diálogo com esses países. Gostaria de cumprimentar a minha amiga Adriana ZEBULUN, representando o Instituto Brasil-Israel. Gostaria de cumprimentar a doutora Stephanie, que eu estou tendo o prazer de conhecer no presente momento, no presente data. Cumprimentar a todos da plateia, em especial aos meus colegas desembargadores aqui presentes, aos meus amigos, vejo aqui alguns na plateia, mas um agradecimento especial ao Ricardo Gorodovitz, que foi a pessoa que idealizou a vinda do professor Eli, e fez o primeiro contato comigo, no sentido de saber se haveria interesse da EMERJ em trazer esse tema para o debate, e eu consultei o meu irmão desembargador Pinheiro e achamos que esse era o momento ideal para um debate franco. Muito obrigado, Ricardo. Professor Eli, אני לא מדבר עברית, אבל אני רוצה להגיד לכולם בעברית שאני שמח מאוד כי אתה איתנו פה היום. תודה רבה. Apenas agradeci, disse que é uma honra receber o nosso professor aqui hoje, no dia de hoje. Meu caro professor Eli, A partir do momento em que eu soube da sua vinda, procurei ler alguma coisa a respeito do seu trabalho. E, pelo que pude compreender de suas ideias, em períodos de crise institucional, as cortes, ou seja, o Poder Judiciário, assumem um papel decisivo para a manutenção da estabilidade democrática. Para o senhor, a independência judicial é um ativo estratégico de estabilidade. Vale dizer, quando as demais instituições falham ou se omitem, o Poder Judiciário é quem deve assumir a coordenação racional do sistema político. Daí, salvo o melhor juízo, o seu entendimento, no sentido de que a velha teoria dos freios e contrapesos deve ser articulada com a economia institucional. Logo, ainda na esteira das suas ideias, a independência judicial deve ser compreendida como um ideal normativo, não como um ideal normativo abstrato, mas sim como um mecanismo funcional de alinhamento entre os poderes. A partir desse arcabouço teórico, professor Eli, o senhor sustenta duas teses a respeito da independência e da importância do Poder Judiciário. A primeira, se eu estiver errado, o senhor, por favor, me corrija. A primeira, a preservação do Estado de Direito, mesmo em condições extremas como guerra, terrorismo e etc. E a segunda é que, nos dias de hoje, há uma delegação por omissão, ou seja, políticos eleitos pelo povo que devem legislar, mas não o fazem. Escolhem não escolher. Está no seu livro, Choose, Not Choose. Not. Transferindo esse poder, então, para as cortes e agências reguladoras. Essa é uma síntese que eu pude perceber dos seus escritos, que são vários, de livros laureados aí ao redor do mundo e que hoje são estudados por alunos de diversos matizes e que gostam da área do direito constitucional e do direito de Estado. E eu gostaria, então, professor Eli, de fazer um paralelo entre a situação de Israel e a situação do Brasil, se é que podemos falar assim. Em Israel, em 2023, 2024, tentou-se apagar o poder judiciário com a aprovação de emenda às Basic Laws de Israel, não permitindo, essas emendas não permitiriam aquilo que constava nas Basic Law, que era o poder judiciário rever atos administrativos praticados pelo governo. A matéria foi levada à Suprema Corte de Israel e, por 8-7, salvo o melhor juízo, mantiveram, com a graça divina, os poderes do judiciário. No Brasil, professor Eli, nós vivemos, ainda hoje, tempos sombrios. Houve sérios ataques à democracia que levou o Supremo Tribunal, a nossa Suprema Corte, a atuar. E isso resultou em processos judiciais contra diversas pessoas. E, nesse atuar da Suprema Corte, há vozes que dizem, e que, estranhamente, para mim, conhecedor, por exemplo, de matéria penal, houve a supressão das figuras de acusar e julgar, e o Supremo assume uma função quase que ocupando o sistema acusatório inteiro. Ou seja, o Supremo apurou os fatos, o Supremo julgou os fatos. Isso deu margem a críticas de todo, ou de boa parte dos operadores do direito aqui no Brasil. E uma outra situação que me pareceu muito curiosa em relação ao Supremo diz respeito justamente à escolha de não escolher, que foi exatamente o caso das Big Techs, onde o nosso parlamento não votava nenhuma lei e o Supremo, então, atuou e dirimiu a questão a respeito do tema. Então, são duas situações muito paralelas em que o Judiciário teve que intervir porque estava sob ataque constante de grupos antidemocráticos, mas, por outro lado, talvez, eu digo talvez porque eu não tive oportunidade de ler todo o material constante dos processos judiciais em tramitação no Supremo, mas talvez com algum excesso, tanto nas punições quanto no procedimento, violando, talvez, quem sabe, o sistema acusatório, quando assume as funções de apurar, denunciar e julgar, né? Claro que a denúncia foi feita pela Procuradoria-Geral da República e não pelo Supremo, mas a partir de uma investigação feita no próprio âmbito do Supremo Tribunal Federal. Com isso, professor Eli, e para iniciar os debates, eu anotei aqui várias indagações que a gente poderia tentar conversar, mas uma delas é a respeito da sua opinião sobre o ativismo judicial. Quais os limites do judiciário para manter o regime democrático? Porque se nós temos que atuar quando somos agredidos ou quando há omissão legislativa, por outro lado, muitas vezes somos acusados de uma atuação maior do que aquilo que está previsto nas normas e acusam-nos de, então, ativistas judiciais. O nosso ministro Barroso, que infelizmente está nosso amigo, né? Infelizmente está se aposentando, falava que o judiciário tem um papel de empurrar a história. Então, quando não se age, caberia a nós, dentro desse racionalismo que o senhor propõe, impulsionar a história e conseguir alguns avanços, como conseguimos aqui, contra negros, contra mulheres, proibição do aborto, enfim, várias questões, a liberação até da maconha, enfim, existem diversos temas em que o Supremo atuou e, a meu ver, atuou bem. Mas seria isso um ativismo judicial? Seria esse o papel do Supremo Tribunal Federal ou esse seria um papel dos políticos? Essa é uma questão que talvez o senhor, com uma mente mais brilhante que a minha, possa nos esclarecer, nos iluminar. A outra pergunta que eu faria, são várias aqui, professor, se o senhor consegue enxergar paralelos entre a justiça de Israel e a justiça do Brasil, porque existem diferenças flagrantes, formais, e nós aqui aprendemos hoje como funciona Israel e Brasil. Mas esses atos antidemocráticos me parecem que hoje estão permeando o mundo. Com a eleição não de uma direita ou de um Estado liberal na economia, mas de alguns estados que insistem em não serem democráticos, em não permitirem a participação popular como devia. E aí é a segunda pergunta, se o senhor enxerga algum paralelo entre Israel e Brasil nesse aspecto. Vou ficar por aqui para deixar para Stephanie, que ela tem uma lista de perguntas muito grandes, e eu não queria ocupar o tempo todo do senhor aqui e da plateia, mas deixo aqui o meu abraço fraterno nesse dia especial para mim, para minha família e para nós judeus do fim dessa guerra. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much for these words and questions. Let me say something about judicial activism. Judicial activism can be viewed from a pure legal theory point of view and from a political science point of view. Justice Aharon Barak, who was our Supreme Court president for 10 years from the mid-90s to 2005, said everything is justiciable. He is also the person who is responsible for broadening the court review and the court activities. From philosophical legal perspective, every question has an answer in the law, whether it's legal or illegal. That's very simple. So from a perspective of judicial theory or legal theory, jurisprudence, okay, there is no limit to judicial activism. The courts in the history, and again, we are more based on the British tradition, built all kinds of barriers in order not to be perceived as political. For example, standing. If you don't have an invested issue in the matter, you cannot bring it to the court. So, for example, a very problematic issue in Israel history, which is now super problematic, is the draft of the ultra-Orthodox to the army. And when this was brought to the court already in the 70s of the last century, the court said, you know, those who bring it to the court don't have standing. They cannot show that they themselves are affected by the decision not to draft. And in the course of the year, the standing requirement diminished. Now also public organization, civil society organization can apply to the court, even if they cannot show that their personal interest is affected. The court had another doctrine of lack of justiciability. Okay? In foreign matters, we don't have authority because this is not a matter for law. Of course, it is a matter of law. If Israel decides to violate international agreements that are part of the international legal order, it is a matter of foreign relation and it is a legal matter. But the court, with the time, okay, in the past, in order to defend itself, made all these barriers, which in the course of the 90s and early 2000s, the period of judicial activism in Israel, the court actually lowered. So this is the legal theory side. The political side, or the political science side, is that the court wants to preserve its reputation and jurisdiction, and therefore it will not allow itself to intervene in a very, very, very controversial issues that it know that will backfire. So, for example, in the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox males that are not go to the army might be equivalent, for example, to the abortion or the legislation of marijuana in Brazil. The court for many, many years didn't intervene. From the 70s until the late 2010, when it gave the first decision that this is an illegal or unequal enforcement of the law. So it gave 30 years for the country, to the government, to arrange the things with broad consensus. It didn't come, so the court intervened. Now, the political science side is also the side of the government. This is choose not to choose, okay? If you have rational politicians, they will want to have an independent court because they can roll to the court the most difficult issues that will bring to loss of political support for any decision, okay? And then blame the court. It's a very nice game. This is exactly like an independent central bank. You want a good economy that is not a populist economy. You know that, for example, raising interest rate is unpopular. Okay? Then you build an independent central bank. It takes the responsibility outside the hands of the politicians. And of course, afterwards, the politicians can say, oh, like Trump is doing now to the head of the Federal Reserve. It's awful. He blocks our economy. Okay? This is changing the cycle of decision-making from a very short cycle of decision-making of political success, election of the populism in the sense that this government, this politician wants to be elected again, to a long-term consideration. And this is very similar, I think, with regard to judicial activism. Now, when you stop having rational politicians, politicians are not rational anymore, or politicians know that they can manipulate the system to stay in power so they will not be accountable to the voters, then they will stop delegating powers to central bank or to courts. And this is exactly the situation in which I think Israel is in the moment. And maybe this has some equivalence to the Brazilian situation. You know, you gave this two examples of abortions and legalization of marijuana, and I understand, this is my, I really don't know anything about Brazilian politics and Brazilian law, but the current president, okay, might want to do some reform, liberal reform in those issues. And he says, my voters come from the Amazonas, they are very conservative. If I do it, I will be punished. Let's give the court the power to do it. And maybe this is kind of equivalent example. So I think that this also has some similarity. You are a huge country. You have more than 200 million inhabitants and citizens. Israel is a very small country with 10 million people with a very different problem. So what's common to Israel and Brazil, you asked? I think exactly these issues on the theoretical level, whether it's in Brazil, abortions and marijuana, in Israel, it's drafting the ultra-Orthodox or the status of the occupied territories. Very similar, very different issues, but the structure of when do courts decide, when the politicians want the court to decide, when the politicians want to block the court to decide, are actually similar. Thank you.
Agora, para a professora Stephanie Assaf, pesquisadora, inclusive de várias instituições, que está nos prestigiando.
Muito obrigada. Queria primeiro agradecer a presença de todos e agradecer, obviamente, o convite para estar aqui, tanto do Corpo Social do IB, como também aqui da EMERJ. É um prazer enorme estar aqui e fico muito feliz, particularmente, por estar numa mesa com o professor Eli, que é o coordenador do grupo de pesquisa, de um dos grupos de pesquisa do qual eu faço parte, em Israel, da Universidade de Haifa e também da Universidade de Ben-Gurion, ambas de Israel. Eu fiz uma anotação, algumas perguntas. Eu tinha analisado a apresentação antes e algumas outras me surgiram agora. E aí ele fica à vontade para responder todas, enfim, né, para a gente conversar sobre. Fiquei pensando muito nessa mudança, nessa estrutura da democracia israelense, né, antes desses abalos, né, o qual o senhor retratou, se uma mudança na estrutura da democracia, obviamente agora, creio eu, né, que com essa formação atual do governo seria perigosa, mas se talvez ela não fosse interessante em algum momento posterior, por exemplo, a elaboração de uma constituição, algo nesse sentido. Outra pergunta que aí eu tenho um interesse muito pessoal que tem relação com a minha pesquisa, eu fico muito feliz de ver essa retratação das manifestações populares, inclusive o papel delas na manutenção do Estado de Direito, da estrutura, inclusive da própria sociedade. Eu confesso que é muito difícil a gente acompanhar do Brasil notícias sobre, então eu tenho que consultar a mídia israelense com alguma dificuldade. Vejo também matéria no Twitter, acompanho muito o perfil da professora Fânia. E eu queria saber a sua opinião sobre as manifestações, as nacionais, né? Ficou muito claro, mas eu queria saber das internacionais. Alguns movimentos me pareceram muito interessantes, mas alguns outros também me pareceram perigosos em algum sentido e até com um certo toque de antissemitismo e até problemático a questão do Estado de Israel. E aí, por fim, eu elaborei outra pergunta, que talvez seja um pouco complicada também, da relação da guerra com a destruição da democracia israelense, mas não a guerra como uma condição extrema, mas a guerra como um mecanismo fundamental, inclusive operado pelo governo para destruir a estrutura do Estado por dentro. Não seria exatamente uma cortina de fumaça, mas a mobilização dessa guerra, não sei se eu posso falar nesse sentido, nesse processo de destruição da democracia do Estado israelense, operado pelo atual governo. Bem, é isso. Eu elaborei essas 3 pequenas perguntas. Agradeço muito a fala, achei excelente a palestra, muito elucidativa e muito importante também da gente ter acesso a esse tipo de fala, não só no Brasil, mas que isso circule em escala internacional. Acho muito importante a gente ouvir vozes de oposição, ainda mais vozes israelenses e de tanto prestígio e tanto fundamento. Muito obrigada, Eli.
Fazer o registro que a professora Stephanie não é da área jurídica propriamente dita, ela é arquiteta e especialista em planejamento urbano e regional e fez a nossa mesa ficar interdisciplinar. Muito obrigado, professora Stephanie. Professor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to have you over in our group. We have a research group on multiple and cascading extreme conditions and the rule of law. And as you mentioned, Israel is under extreme conditions for many years, extreme conditions of terrorism and war. And the question is how to maintain the rule of law in such conditions when you have a temptation to say, you know, it's so urgent that we have to bypass the law with regard to terrorism, with regard to any other issues. But now what we witness in the world is that we have not only one type of extreme condition, but extreme condition of multiple and cascading type. That extreme condition brings one to another, climate change and pandemic and security, and how do they affect each other, and how the rule of law can maintain itself. And this is the working group, and I'm very happy that Stephanie is there. With regard to your questions, I think, as I said before, we, Fania and I, go to demonstrate every Saturday night in Israel, beginning a week after the announcement of our Minister of Justice of the planned reform, until this very day. And these demonstrations in the beginning were against the attempt constitutional revolution or coup d'etat, and after the 7th of October, they actually switches to demonstration against the government that is not doing anything to help the victims of the 7th of October, to release the hostages, etc., etc. And we were asking ourselves already 2.5 years, we are demonstrating every Saturday. It's quite tiring. We are not effective. Why do we go and do it? So I want to say we were effective. The fact that I described in the beginning, that we managed to prevent the government from doing the constitutional revolution, the Hungarian style, in one go in a very short span of time, was because of these demonstrations. The fact that the hostages were released yesterday is due to these demonstrations in a very interesting, indirect way. Donald Trump, who appreciates power and force, saw these demonstrations. I'm not imagining. I know that, he actually related to them. He said, this is a force, this is a power I have to take into account. It's not that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is the sole source of power in Israel. And this brought him to push Israel to this peace deal. So the fact that we demonstrators don't think that our demonstrations are effective is not correct. The demonstrations are effective. It's true that we cannot change the whole world with demonstrations, but their effectiveness, no question about their effectiveness. Second point of the question of Stephanie was, what does the government want with this judicial overhaul? And here I related to that. I think that the judicial overhaul, the judicial reform, coup d'etat against the judiciary, if you want, or constitutional revolution, are meant to change the character of the state of Israel, not only from the formal way that government is elected or not elected. We have for already 30 years in Israel growing fundamentalism, upgoing religiosity, and the agenda of at least part of the current government is to make Israel a fundamental religious state, with Jewish law replacing secular civil law. In many senses, parts of the Israeli population, or the politicians that represent them, the ultra-Orthodox, the fundamental nationalists, want to turn Israel into a Jewish Iran, where the Jewish law will be above secular law, above a constitutional structure. And this, of course, ranges to all areas, including abortions. The situation in Israel is actually much more liberal than in Brazil, not because of judicial decision-making, by the way, because of compromises that were made in the 70s. but to make Israel a fundamental state in which, follows Jewish law and especially Jewish prohibition. So the agenda of the government does not stop in changing the constitutional structure or weakening the judiciary. It is far more extensive and very dangerous agenda for those who, I'm not talking about democracy, those who believe in liberalism, in freedom. And this is the importance of us trying to prevent these changes.
Há uma pergunta que chegou dos nossos assistentes, que tem um pouco de natureza política, mas antes eu quero fazer um registro, ou melhor, alguns outros registros, pela importância da presença e do tema que debatido, já que hoje estamos abordando a questão da democracia e como o Poder Judiciário é um alicerce para uma democracia, como o Ministério Público é um alicerce para uma democracia, como a advocacia é um alicerce para a democracia. Nós estamos na escola da magistratura, que não tem como destinação ou público-alvo apenas futuros magistrados e magistrados, mas sim a justiça como um todo. Então, há um corpo. E aqui, professor, eu quero também fazer o registro que há defensores institucionais que eu não posso deixar de mencionar e agradecer a presença. Uma, doutora Andressa Cansado, promotora de justiça do Ministério Público do Rio de Janeiro, grande defensora institucional, do juiz Marcelo Oliveira Silva, também grande defensor dos postulados da nossa magistratura, dentre os vários advogados, doutora Mônica Posses, que na região serrana pontuou como defensora e muito lutou pela magistratura, pela advocacia, e dentre os vários advogados, não posso deixar de citar, né, José Carlos Tortman, defensor público, e que, já que estamos falando em democracia, pagou com a própria liberdade, foi preso, perseguido no governo que se instalou nos anos 60 no Brasil e se tornou um dos grandes nomes e nossas referências. Mas queria também fazer aqui um registro especial pela presença da esposa do professor Eli, Fânia Oz Salzberg, historiadora, escritora, professora emérita da Universidade de Haifa, e tem a particularidade de ser filha de Amos Oz. Tá? Eu quero muito homenageá-la. O livro Judas dele, um grande pacifista, tá? Que já nos deixou. E eu quero agradecer muito e quero pedir uma salva de palmas à professora. Estamos já encerrando e eu vou passar para o professor um questionamento que ele fique à vontade. Eu sei que é um homem corajoso, mas não queremos dar um lado político. A pergunta que eu disse que é a seguinte: por favor, pergunte para o professor da Ana Luísa Carvalhal, Elisa Alsberg. Vamos ver que haverá uma nova mudança. Veremos o primeiro-ministro sendo julgado ou não, como a pedido do presidente Trump, que perdoe Netanyahu. Com o fim da guerra, as atenções vão se voltar para qual destino do chanceler? Se ele renuncia ou continua no governo? Bom, o professor Eli, claro, ele não tem bola de cristal, evidentemente, ele tem a sua visão. E, evidentemente, não queremos aqui entrar em aspectos políticos, e sim institucionais e do judiciário, mas devemos dizer que aqui no Brasil nós temos sido atingidos também por setores, todos sabem, do governo dos Estados Unidos contra membros do nosso judiciário. Então, acho que isso está dentro de um contexto. Então, professor, fique à vontade se quiser responder.
Thank you. I was asked before about the common features of Brazil and Israel. This is one common feature. Trump wants to intervene in the internal judicial process in Brazil as he wants to interfere in the judicial process in Israel. And this is, of course, based on his own experience. I think the public in Israel is very smart. Okay? And when people saw yesterday in the Knesset that President Trump calls the president of Israel to give pardon, clemency to Netanyahu, that this is not Trump's initiative, but actually Netanyahu asked Trump to say this over the podium. So I'm not sure if it will be effective as in the Brazilian case. Okay? If you ask me to the merits of the question, if we can get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu forever, in exchange of pardoning him in the small corruption charges that he's faced now, I will say that it's something that can be considered. You have a cause also in formal legal reasoning that you can close an investigation or you can actually acquit a person for the public interest, or if there is no general interest in prosecuting him. If we can safeguard that Netanyahu is gone forever from the Israeli political landscape, this is a public interest that might merit pardoning him. But, you know, that he is on charges on actually quite minor things, the cigarettes, the champagne. There is a pile of other allegations that were not brought until this day to prosecution. The submarine affairs, that he bought submarines for huge amounts of money just for which benefited him personally. The Qatargate affair, which are much more serious. And if in the future investigation will show that there is enough prima facie proof to put him on trial on these charges, these are charges that cannot just be scrapped for the benefit of him being disappearing from the political landscape. So at the moment, I don't think that his trial will be stopped. It's very likely that if he continues his political life, the trial will be ended with conviction, at least partial conviction. As I said, there are some issues there which are very, very obvious. There are more complicated issues. For example, the question whether you can bribe a newspaper for favorable coverage. This is a more complicated issue from a pure legal point of view. But a possible resolution will be that he will be convicted for the small issues of getting champagnes and cigars, which is, you know, it's not a huge crime, but it is an offense. And this will make him disappear from our political arena. But maybe this is also wishful thinking.
Pessoal, mais uma vez quero agradecer, estamos cumprindo regimentalmente o nosso horário. Eu antes queria entregar à professora Stephanie ou Stephanie? Stephanie Assafo, que é o chute para fazer a entrega, assim como eu também vou entregar ao chute certificado assinado pelo nosso diretor-geral, chamado Cláudio Delotto. Para aqueles que participaram, vou pedir também professora ADRIANA, ZEBULUN.
Obrigada.
Em especial, quero entregar ao professor Eli, mas a Escola da Magistratura não poderia deixar de, primeiro, agradecer muito ao Instituto Brasil-Estados Unidos por essa... Brasil, perdão, o Brasil e Israel Ricardo, que logo pontuou e fez a iniciativa de nós podermos realizar este evento, trazer o professor Eli, que veio a São Paulo, e de São Paulo para o Rio, para nos brindar com a sua conferência. A Caroline Mello, quero te agradecer muito, você e a Ana Beatriz, da Escola da Magistratura, foram aquelas que cuidaram da logística para que tudo corresse bem, quero agradecer de coração. E também a Escola da Magistratura, nosso diretor-geral, autorizou que registrássemos este evento com uma placa ao professor Eli Salzberg. Ela está em inglês e português, e eu peço, então, ao Marcos André Schultz que faça as honras da casa e entregue ao professor.
Professor Eli, as democracias nascem, mas também morrem. Algumas renascem ou ressurgem mesmo após momentos sombrios. No entanto, para que se tornem perenes, conforme o ideal grego, são necessárias ou necessários ações e pensamentos como os praticados pelo professor Eli Salzberg, a quem a Escola da Magistratura do Estado do Rio de Janeiro agradece pela conferência. Judiciário sob Cerco, o caso israelense da luta por democracia. Muito obrigado. Um fraterno abraço em homenagem a um dos escritores mais famosos que eu mais gosto de Israel, que é o pai da nossa... Thank you very much.
Next time I will try to speak in Brazilian.
Tirar um foto aqui rapidinho?
Sim, por favor, Stephanie. Agradecer a todas as presenças, eu sei do agendamento, da atividade de cada um, aqueles que nos assistiram, e foram muitos, de maneira virtual, a toda a logística, a Escola da Magistratura, ao Instituto Brasil-Israel, os nossos agradecimentos, e estou por encerrado o nosso evento.